Hello and welcome to Bangladesh Feminist Oral History Project brought to you by the Bangladesh Feminist Archives. I'm Tanvir Anoy. I'm an academic and author, archivist, and activist, and I'm honored to be in conversation today with one of the most powerful feminist thinkers and educators of our time. In this project, we are documenting the experiences, politics, and reflections of Bangladeshi feminists whose work has transformed not only national landscapes, but also shaped transnational feminist conversations. Today, we are joined by Dr. Dina M Siddiqi, a feminist anthropologist, writer, and educator whose work has been central to unpacking the intersections of labor, gender, nationalism, Islam, and transnational capital in Bangladesh and beyond. Currently, Dr. Siddiqi is clinical associate professor at New York University. Her career spans decades of rigorous scholarship, grassroots engagement, and radical pedagogy. From government workers' rights to state violence, from child marriage to politics of NGO-ization, Professor Dina has consistently pushed us to rethink feminist knowledge, ethics, and solidarity. Her writing has appeared in Feminist Review, Duke University Press, Samaj, Contemporary South Asia, and countless anthologies and journals. She's always a powerful public voice, appearing in forums, podcasts, and global conferences, always bringing Bangladesh into sharper feminist focus. Professor Siddiqui, let's begin with your own story. So, what sparked your early political and feminist consciousness?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. That is a very generous introduction, very kind introduction. So thank you. And I'm very delighted to be here. I really appreciate this initiative that you're taking. So I'm thrilled. Thank you for inviting me. What sparked my early interest? I want to take a little bit of time with this question because I think my biography really has shaped my ideology, my feminist and theoretical predispositions, and the way I think about my world. And there was no one moment or incident. I do think I come from a family of very strong women, and including my mother, everyone worked, everyone had higher degrees, almost everybody had love marriages. In those days, that was actually very unusual. But I think the singular influence on my thought of what it meant to be a woman came from my grandmother, and I'll just give you two short stories, and I that have stayed with me, told to me by my youngest Kala, who was the one I spent a lot of time listening to her stories. My grandmother came from Kolkata, really literally overnight after partition. Classic story. They didn't have property. They had a rented home. They'd locked it up because the three daughters were, in danger and sexual and other kinds of danger. So she came, so it didn't have a lot of money in Dhaka. And my mother and my mother's younger sister enrolled in Dhaka University. And at one point, they had what they called study tours. They were going to go to Lahore for a study tour. They didn't have enough money. And what my grandmother did have was a gold chain she was saving for my Khala's wedding. And they decided, my grandmother said, "Thik ache, let us sell this. Your education and your going to Lahore is more important." That story really stayed with me. This is a story from the 50s, right? About what was prioritized and it wasn't. And it goes with another story. My aunt Salma Khan, who actually ended up being chair of CEDAW, by the way. So, when I say I have powerful women in the family, I've just seen them go places. She apparently wanted to be an artist, and she really wanted to go to art college, তখন. But my grandmother insisted she study economics so she could stand on her own feet. So these are stories I heard when I was 10 or 12. These are stories I grew up with, what to be, how to be a woman. That was one thing, along with my grandmother's stories of generosity and hospitality. I really thought, but there was one other thing. I had a cousin, my mother had a cousin, a Kala, but not an immediate Kala, who was very obviously abused, very violently abused by her husband. Also, this is happening at the same time. And my mother, everybody in my immediate family insisted she leave her husband. They made arrangements at hospitals. There was no idea that there was no sense to, you have to stay in your marriage. I thought, and again, at that time, and that was very unusual too, that was there. So I had, in a sense, a very privileged upbringing without the usual feminist gender struggles that young girls grow up with, which also meant I was a little bit sheltered. I didn't know about other people's struggles as much, but by the time I went to Wellesley College, I felt I was a fully formed feminist. But I was also very political because I was a little bit of a nerd. I was also very political. And I remember when I was growing up, long before your time, in the old days, that we had a lot of Palestinian students who would come to Bangladesh to study medicine. Right. And in those days, we would go to the airport to see off people. I don't know who we were seeing off, but a really strong political memory for me was seeing these young 18, 19-year-old women, boys, young men, who had suddenly been called by the PLO to go fight in Beirut. And because it was the airport in those days, we were milling around, nobody was paying me attention. I spoke to several of those young men, and that really left a strong impression on me. And I began to think of, this is ridiculously romanticized, Laila Khalid. I don't know if you know her, but Laila Khalid was for a couple of years my role model. Not that I could ever be anything like her. I found her to be a very romantic figure. I don't know that I really understood the politics, but I wanted to be like her. Or not that I had a cause either, but it was also, there was something I was not a standard, either a standard feminist or a standard anything, but I was very interested in questions of justice from very early on between my Kala who refused to leave. It was very interesting. She could not see herself not being married, even though it was all, her subjectivity was so tied in with this idea of respectability. And everybody around her was telling her to leave. So that, seeing my Nanu and hearing her stories, and this idea of global injustice together has really shaped who I am. And one more thing, because this Islam stuff is going to come up, I grew up with a mother who was a Kolkata Muslim, you could say, very into modernity and being urban. And my father was Purano Dhakar, Qurane Hafiz, in a madrasa, and he eventually got a PhD. But I grew up I grew up without any fear of religion and fear of patriarchy. That gives me a certain kind of freedom, perhaps. I didn't have to struggle. My father was wonderful. He was all of these things, and I am who I am, not because I ever struggled against him. He sent me to Wellesley. When I got into Wellesley, I heard people say, your father will never let you go. What kind of a Quran Hafiz would let his daughter go off? My father was so proud and getting me this, made sure I had money to get there, my $300 in the bank that he sent me off with. But, I didn't face anything. So I never thought of religion as something to be afraid of. And that has really shaped my theoretical perspectives, I think. So that's my backstory.
Oh, wow, Professor Siddiqui, that was really, really, really insightful to hear from you. It was really,
Maybe.
really great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. So, can I ask you, like, were there moments in your personal or academic life that crystallized the direction you would take as a feminist and scholar?
Right. Okay. Maybe I should start with a very personal thing about my body in the world, as feminists, talk about. So I had polio when I was very young. So I have a drop foot, I have various things. I was very awkward and you could say undesirable to the male gaze. for a very long time, and that stays with you, right? So I was very attentive to the ways in which women's bodies and women's beauty produce value for humanity. I think for me, because obviously there were moments, very, very injurious moments in my life, right? So I think that made me very conscious of things like the beauty industry, things, things like, the way in which women get objectified. I had a particular kind of view on it. If you were going to tell me black is beautiful, kalo meyederkeও biye kora যায়, I was like, why do you need to be beautiful to be married? Do you not have anything else in you? Why is beauty? You don't say that about men. You don't say kalo purushderkeও biye kora যাবে. So the beauty remains. And I've always wanted to really understand and push back a little bit. Of course, beauty is a wonderful thing in some abstract way. We all want beauty in different ways. I want my spaces to be beautiful. It's nice to feel beautiful, but it's that, and it particularly in the way over time I've seen the way capitalism and patriarchy come together to promote beauty. I think my sensitivity to that comes from my real bodily experiences. That's one thing. That's a very personal thing. But in my academic life, I learned Wellesley was a women's college. I didn't know, তখন, you just go. Those were not the days. I just was going to a place where my mother gave me an application and I filled it out and I got a scholarship and I arrived. But it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me as a liberal arts college, but also as a women's college. I didn't know. I mean, it was interesting later finding we would have people come from Dartmouth, men from Dartmouth would be in our economics classes. We didn't know that we women were, or women from Dartmouth would come. They would be very quiet. We didn't have any, we had a certain kind of confidence that I don't know what it's like today. If you go, it's not as bad. But I found that not going to a co-ed place had given me an invisible kind of confidence that I got. But I also, I went into Wellesley wanting to be an economist. I came out as an anthropologist and it changed my life. My first anthropology class I took, I just decided this is the way to change the world. Development, I need to think about anthropology. I never, I went in wanting to be like a typical person, wanting to change conditions in Bangladesh, not, but I have always been a little bit at an angle to the world, if you could say. I didn't want to go work at the World Bank, but I did want to do something, right? But I realized that Wellesley taught me how to think critically. The one thing that I found at Wellesley as a feminist, it shaped me as a scholar. It shaped me as a feminist, a transnational feminist, because those were the days all of my friends were taking courses on Black feminism, Latino feminism, lesbian feminism, even Native American literatures, but there was nothing outside of the US. I never took a single women's studies class. There was just nothing for me. I didn't, and it was because those classes did not, there was such a nationalist exceptionalism. So that turned me into thinking about the global. I loved Wellesley, but it did not have a space for me as a person from Bangladesh, except in my development economics classes, but then that's a whole other thing. So I think, those are the moments. One other moment personally, and I can talk about this perhaps later, I'll start with this now, is when I was in graduate school. Something happened. I don't remember when it happened, what year, but this maybe it was in graduate school. There were some, Bangladeshi, often you have these cases of violence where women's names come to be attached to it. Right, so you have Yasmin Hatta, I'll talk about later, Rima Hatta. Rima Hatta was long before your time, but it was of a woman. Her husband was the son of a very famous gynecologist. She was the daughter of a Mukti Jodha, Her husband had a mistress who was older. And eventually, this was a classic story where her husband physically abused her. She kept wanting to leave him. They couldn't, they kept sending her back. Eventually, he kills her, right? And he goes off with his mistress. And the way the story was told, and it became a huge, that was my first moment of Dhaka feminist politics that I engaged with, and I couldn't understand. There was such a division within the women's movement too. There was so much moralizing. I think there would be much less of it today. It was so much about um, the virgin and the whore dichotomy. So this innocent Rima, this very seductive older hack type woman, whore, cuckoo who had seduced this man. That story was being told. What nobody was talking about is the violence inherent in compulsory heteropatriarchal marriage. And I remember writing a paper in grad school about that, right? That's what I did, but that made me really think about. And some people, I was in Dhaka for part of the time, and I went to one of these women's groups coming together, and there was a woman standing next to me saying, "I don't believe in the death penalty except for Iqbal." I mean, there was these Iqbal was the man concerned, right? There was just so much. I just feel, the one thing you couldn't talk about marriage. The problem was not the compulsory heteropatriarchal marriage. As far as a lot of the analysis was concerned, it was terrible. It was a really interesting moment that left me not exactly enraged, left me convinced that whatever I do, I must always think about the straight woman who is in a marriage, because everything else, if we don't unpack this, we won't understand other kinds of marginality. This is what people are trying to protect in the name of protecting, women from violence, whatever. So that was actually a moment that stayed with me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dina Siddiqui. I'm sorry, I'm just going back with Dina, Dr.
You can
Professor.
call me whatever you
Yeah.
like. Yeah,
Okay. So
absolutely.
thank you. So Dina, so how did your education at Michigan and then back to Bangladesh shape the
Hmm.
tensions you hold between the global and the grounded?
Right. Yeah. No, you have really good questions, by the way.
Thank
So
you.
this is
Thank
really making me think. Michigan was wonderful in a different way. I was in a South Asia department. It was exciting people coming through. What I learned two things that South Asia in those days in the US meant learning a lot about India and a lot about caste. But there was this amazing feminist literature coming out. This was the time, I don't know, you must have read Lata Mani and the recasting women, that entire volume. I was reading things like that. I was voraciously reading things like that and thinking, why don't we have, where is our Lata Mani? I want to write things. I ended up doing something slightly different initially for my dissertation, but I thought we need to have our own voices. I want Lata Manis of the world to talk about, in Bangladesh. So there is but I got so much out of thinking about the politics. That's when I really also started thinking about the politics of knowledge production. That was the first time I started thinking about how knowledge making in the global south is connected to knowledge, actually, not what knowledge of the global south is connected to knowledge making in the north. And it's got a long colonial history. And I kept thinking about, so why do when we're thinking about Bengalis, I kept picking up books called Bengali Women, and ethnography, whatever, Monisha Roy. Like, why am I missing from? It wasn't so much a personal thing for me at that point, but where is East Bengal? Why is East Bengal not part of this? So I became very attentive to the ways in which categories like Bengal, you know, like Hindu, like Muslim, like secularism are produced through power relations that are colonial, right? And I had in my head, and I began to realize how problematic carrying what I learned in graduate school, or the ways we learned in graduate school taught me how to think critically in a different way, right? Of course. But so when I came back to Bangladesh, I wanted to change all of these categories and things, but I also wanted to um, do this without Prathame going into academia. So I had two things that happened. What I realized is you can think about the global and you can unpack the global, but when you arrive at a real space, it has its own politics. Right? So it's not so easy to just intervene. And the real I found it two questions came up for me. Who speaks for Bangladeshi feminists and who speaks for the nation? So I'm coming in from abroad. And we tried to live there for 2 or 3 years. And we did, it was interesting. It didn't quite work out, but certain kinds of critiques of development that I could make in the US could not be heard or could not be made in those days, at least, in Bangladesh, right? Like, there was just no space for that. It didn't make sense, right? So there was that. Especially, it could be thought of as, you could be dismissed or ignored as you are from the global north. What do you really know, right? I'm sure there are different versions of this that continue. What became particularly not problematic, interesting for me is that over time, because I had developed an interest in Islam, it wasn't there originally. Um, in my original thing, I wrote about Parda in my dissertation, but it was what the women were saying. So I was, or it was part of the given literature on breaking up on women refusing Parda. But anyway, this fear of, I thought that in a certain way, I don't know how detailed you want me to go, but I found that bringing Islamophobia or questions of Islamophobia and how it might or might not inform what's happening in Bangladesh produce tremendous tensions. That's so development and Islam. Those were two spaces of tension that I found initially hard to negotiate. So what I ended up doing is writing about Bangladesh, but not really. I found my work wasn't particularly read anyway. When I was producing it, it's very interesting how things I've written 15, 20 years ago are now actually being read quite a lot, right? But at that time, nobody was paying attention because a lot of the knowledge that was being produced was supposed to be for policy, supposed to have recommendation. Yeah. And this is what happened in graduate school. I went to graduate school at a time when there was this idea that there was too much knowledge. Economists produced very crude instrumental knowledge. We anthropologists were going to produce much more nuanced knowledge, and it wasn't meant to have an immediate kind of impact. We were unpacking everything that economists were doing wrong, right? That's what I thought. That's what I was taught. I think I have a little bit, I have, I have a lot more respect for economists than when I first came out of graduate school. It was just very interesting timing for the training. But I do think that the way in which people who And I think I'm going to one of your questions, already, but there, I found initially that going back to Bangladesh meant that I had to really retrain my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Dinapa. And this is your oral history interview, feminist oral history interview.
Yeah.
Like you can tell anything, and like you have like all the time you need. Okay, so don't
Okay.
hesitate to like to
Oh, okay.
say
All right.
anything.
Yeah, I
Okay.
didn't want, yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much for that answer, and we're going to go for a little bit, I would say tense, I would say question. So yeah,
Uh,
like in my sense. So Dinapa, so much of your scholarship has
mm,
focused on the garment industry, right, in Bangladesh.
right. Yeah.
Not just in terms of labor, but also in relation to state, gender, and global
Right.
capital. So, how do you see garment workers in Bangladesh today as political agents, as feminists, or as workers who disrupt categories?
Again, I think that's a really thoughtful question that you've come up with. Clearly, I have written a lot on it, so you've clearly been reading my work. Um, so, and again, part of this is my training as an anthropologist to see things beyond the obvious, even beyond obvious so-called progressive frames. And I found already that I wasn't comfortable with the two ways in which garment workers were being represented. So, one was the modernization theory, especially Muslim women being empowered, coming out of their homes and suddenly becoming free through wage labor, a wonderful capitalist trajectory. That's one kind of narrative around garment workers that was there, and it continues to be there in different ways today, slightly modified. And the other narrative was the real Marxist narrative, for which I have a lot more sympathy. I should say, this is not, I'm not rejecting it, which is that, people were saying these sweatshops using saying sweatshops are just totally exploitative and we have to shut them down. Now, the reality is a lot more complex, a lot more contradictory, a lot more inconsistent, right? That's what I was trying to show. Neither fully captures the complexities or the contradictions of garment workers' real lives, because garment workers have been their representations globally and nationally do particular kinds of ideological work. And I really want to say that before talking about that. So they go from, there are moments, they're hailed as national heroes. Aren't they great? We're bringing in 80% of work. The BGMEA will say, we'll have these glossy brochures. The government of Bangladesh will also have these glossy ideas, thoughts, on how the industry is empowering Muslim women, right? It's a wonderful thing. So they are, I think I found them alternating between being hailed as national heroines saving the nation through their labor, right? They're there not for themselves really. In this way, they themselves, what you are asking for, their subjectivities are constantly displaced onto other people's goals, right? That's what's happening. So either they become national heroines saving the nation through their labor, or they are stigmatized. And I'll give you one example of something that happened, probably, hopefully not before you were born, no, in 2003. Okay. I think something called the multi-fiber arrangement, um, which was an agreement, a global agreement that allowed Bangladesh to have access to markets in the US, duty-free access and without quotas. That agreement was going to be, it was going to run out basically. And there was tremendous, again, panic, moral panic. What I was interested in is the moral panic. So you had stories, this was the time when they were still worried about HIV AIDS. So you had stories. I mean, I have a report from Action Aid and something else. All the newspapers carried stories about what would happen if these garment workers would be thrown out of jobs. Well, what would happen is they and their children and their families would not be able to eat or pay their rent, is what one would think. But no, the fear was, and this is where class comes in. I am constantly trying to bring class into my analysis because the category of woman is such a homogeneous, generic category in so much feminist thinking in Europe and America, but also in Bangladesh and in policy. So the idea was that the fear was that these garment workers, these working class garment workers, would be on the streets inciting or, seducing our middle class boys. And what are we going to do about that? That I have that. I have actually the Daily Star um has a little essay by me. They were very good. They published this, called Beyond the Doomsday Scenario, where I actually write about this. It's like, come on, let's get beyond, beyond that. But this is so these are the two poles through which, and you see the way in which garment workers are constructed through working class lens, through middle class Bhadralok lenses, just keeps coming out, and you saw that during COVID too. The fear of them, the keeping them away, the putting them, trying to keep them, there was something, it was slightly different, but it was still that Bhadralok mentality of they are not us. Let us keep them in a different space. That comes out. So this is the figure of the garment worker has been very usefully invoked by global corporations. They cannot be, who will say, hey, we might be paying one of the lowest wages in the world, but after all, they are being empowered. So, we're doing something. They're actually using that empowerment discourse for their, profits, right? And the figure of the, sweatshop worker is wonderful for them. They can say they're lifting women out of poverty, right? That's there. So all of this is happening. Now, I actually think what garment workers, are they feminists? I don't think they're going around thinking they're feminists. Who goes around thinking that except for people like us, right? Because we are part of, in that sense, the movement. They are living, I think it's been 40 years, right? Actually, it's not a new industry. And it's been a couple of generations, right? Over that time, garment workers have totally reshaped the urban landscape. And as Firdaus Azim says somewhere, um, they've actually, there's been a kind of a quiet revolution of spatial use. They've really challenged the gendered and sexualized spaces of the city because they had to be there. As I've written many times, their bodies had to be visible. Their bodies have now made it possible, I think, for many more working lower to middle class bodies to be out there, right? So they're part of a feminist revolution. You don't need to say you're a feminist to do that, right? I think they have done something tremendous, right? Without meaning that they're also, we can think of them as just normal people, consumers. Right now, I'm doing a little bit of research on, why garment workers, and especially young ones, are wanting to wear burqas more and more, and we can talk about that later. But I think to answer your question about are they agents, I think they do disrupt categories, right? They are not, because they don't come off what the BGMEA and the government would like, I think. And of course, the corporations is docile workers in the workplace being very happy just to have jobs, right? But workers, particularly because of the conditions of the supply chain, cannot but be out there on the streets. They keep um, disrupting the good worker. A good worker, my work from a long time ago, my dissertation, a good worker is also a typical Palo Bangali woman, girl who doesn't speak back. So it's a way in which factory discipline, I found out a long time ago, I don't know what happens now, is women would be disciplined by saying, "I ভালো মেয়েরা তো এরকম করে না, তুমি মুখের উপরে সুপারভাইজারের সাথে কেন কথা বলছো? তুমি তো ভালো মেয়ে." And because garment work was so stigmatized, workers had to constantly negotiate this stigma, right? Of, are you going to be a ভালো মেয়ে, or are you going to speak out and say, "No, you are violating my rights"? Right? That's where the culture and political economy part come out. It's really interesting. But garment workers are constantly saying, yes, we want to be workers. We want this industry to survive, but on our terms. The problem is, I don't think they're being thought of as political agents, as political subjects, or as citizens, precisely because of the way they are. People need them to be. They need them to be sort of signs of our modernity in Bangladesh, or signs of empowerment, of signs of economic growth. When you have policies, the policies are all about how to protect the industry, and this is where there's this whole discourse of, what I was saying, saving, you have to save the industry before you can, and the women have to save the industry, right? So you can't ever ask for your rights, because you need to sacrifice your rights for the moment. That's what's happening. But if garment workers are real political subjects, they should have a voice. I'm actually going to make a pitch for the Labor Reform Commission and say, I think they did try to do that. And one of the things they said, it's a minor thing that nobody will talk about, to even consider, because I've heard this more and more. Actually, I hadn't heard this in the early years, that they don't think people treat them as manush. Okay, people do not treat them as humans. And again, I'm going to bring in our middle class bhadralok mentality. They don't treat us মানুষের মতো ব্যবহার করে না. So what they have, I saw this little thing in the Labor Commission, is, people should learn not to use the tui or even the tumi for workers. You have supervisors all have always called workers tui. Already you can see the power relation. How can there be any kind of dignity at work if you're going to call somebody tui, right? In that sense, it's a very minor thing, but I thought clearly it's very important for your thinking about who the other person there is on the other side you're negotiating with. So I really, really appreciated that. I think garment workers are very strong. I just have so much respect for these women who work so hard and have to come back. There's no socialized childcare, there's no anything, right? Really, they have to come back and do all this reproductive, social reproduction of labor and go back. It's amazing. Of course, they do wear out. They are disposable bodies. They are quite literally disposed of after a while, right? So that's, so they're being, but I think I just see them as, people with different, they're very different. The married women are so different from the single women. The single women still have dreams. It's such a mixed, we shouldn't just think of the garment worker either. I hope that answers some of your question.
Oh my, that was really great. And I really, really appreciate the work you do. And I really, really appreciate like whatever you're kind of like explaining right now with us. I have
Okay.
2 points to add with that. It's very
Okay.
interesting is that so whenever you're talking about that, like Bhadra Mera Bolena or like,
Uh,
decent Mera, I
uh,
have a really vague memory of that. Like I do not know how I place myself in Bangladesh, I would say, class system because is very crucial. And thank you so much for saying that, because in USA as well, we talk about race so much.
Yeah.
We do not very much talk about class. And whenever I kind of like indicate class,
Mm.
here the American people just kind of like very uncomfortable to like to address that. But
Yeah.
class is a really crucial thing to like to address with,
Yeah.
right? Bangladesh middle class, or like the definition of middle class, is very weird for me, I would say, because whenever it comes with middle class, I do not see my in a lower middle class. I don't see my in a like upper middle class. I'm
Yeah.
kind of like semi upper middle class family from I'm here.
Yeah.
And my experience that like my vague experience is that I was maybe class standard 3, I think it's around 2005, where a lot of like I would say domestic workers are leaving for garments work, right?
Right.
And my house, in my house, my mother had helpers, right?
Mm.
And I vaguely remember my relatives were very, very negative about like young girls, particularly leaving, I would say, domestic worker jobs for garments works, and they kind
Mm.
of vilified their characteristics about that, like
Mm.
that is something is not a bhalo me are supposed to
Mm.
do, right? That is something it stayed with me. But the one thing came out from my mother is that my mother never discouraged these domestic workers to like to go out and like have this kind of jobs. She always said like, oh, fine, she is very young. She should supposed to like to, explore and stuff as well. So that's something, that distinction kind of like made me like to think about like, the whole bhalo me or kharap me, or the, like comparing like domestic work is far better, I would say, honest, or like I would say um কি বলবো আর কি অনেক
Mm.
দায়িত্ববান, or like very মর্যাদাপূর্ণ কাজ,
Right.
rather honorable work, rather than going to a garments worker, like like saying like bad girls go to, or like go to this garments work, or like this kind of like jobs. So that's something I really wanted to share with you.
Right.
That's you kind of
Yeah.
work there a lot. So that's something like stayed with me for a long time, that like the whole distinction between bhalo me versus kharap me,
Right.
or like how you also kind of like feeling that way, because there are a lot of I have seen like relatives and other folks are saying that like they're very scared that like domestic workers will be in lesser number, as a lot of young women
Yes.
are going to do that. So they really have to do that work by themselves, and they're not
Right.
happy
That's a
about it.
great way
So
to
that
help
is something
people.
I really wanted to add with your point. Yeah.
Can I add something to that?
Absolutely. Go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
no, no, I remember that. It was a very interesting moment in time, actually, when this first started happening. So I'm glad you remembered that, and I'm so glad your mother encouraged these women to go. Let me just think about, again, this class thing is so interesting. Think about, basically, if you work in somebody's house, it's a 24-hour job. It's really, if you want to think about it as servitude of a certain kind, because really in the middle of the night, they can call you and say, "Ekটু চা বানিয়ে দাও, আমার মাথা ধরেছে," right? That's one thing. The second thing is that you are, in many, many households, it's not a safe space. So the parents of poor girls might put you in a domestic space to protect you, but there is so much sexual harassment and sexual violation in these spaces, and these girls have no way of, they have to leave. I've just, we've seen and we know, right? So there's nothing even safe about that, right? So you can imagine, especially when it first came up, how enthusiastic young women were to, they could go to the factory. It was 9 to 5 or 8 to 10 maybe, but then they had a certain autonomy. They had dignity, as you said. They got paid, well, mostly, right? And they had a kind of identity. One of the things I said, and apparently now it's much more of a middle class identity. I've started my work is much more on labor now rather than the women, on women organizing right now. But this thing that we did in 2003 women really felt that they had a professional identity. So they would say, even then, we're going to the office. They're not saying, I mean, kajel lok, chakor. It's very interesting. Amader chakri, chakor, the etymology of the word is interesting, but it's so when we think about that, there's something again very troubling about that. There was one other thing I wanted to say about sex work. Oh, so girls were vilified also and stigmatized when they went to the factories as well. So one of the things I found, two things in my own research is, then they would say, but the factory is a bondho jaiga. We are protected in the factory. So they almost domesticated the space of the factory and said, oh, our supervisors are like our fathers here. They're protecting us. So they used the language in the same way they said, we do porta of the mind, or our porta is different, right? Women had agency. They reconstituted ideas of porta as they went across the street. Yeah, but I remember, I don't know if you remember this, you would have been very small, but garment worker became almost a gali for a while. So there was some incident at Dhaka University of sexual harassment of university students in a hall, female students. And the VC of that time, I really should look up this story, but the VC of that time called these women, you were behaving and looking like garment workers. So garment workers had a particular kind of valence,
Yeah.
such a
Still
negative
it is.
valence.
Still, it's a
It's
really, really gruesome, I would say, as a slang
really
used. Yeah, absolutely.
okay.
Like Gramir Mein, Villager Mein, and like
Yeah,
garments worker. These two are really, really, econo.
right. Yeah. I would like to think something has changed, but I
No,
I take your yeah, I take your word for
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Now I have more two things to add because your conversation
Well,
going
this is what a
again and again.
conversation is about.
Yeah, yeah. So it reminds me of also that like also the age disparity. Like suppose like the young woman can go for garments work, but the middle age woman cannot do garments work. Okay,
Mhm,
they are supposed to do the chuta buakaj or the buakaj, I would say. That kind of
mhm.
like depicted. That's something came out just came out in
Yeah,
my
yeah,
mind.
yeah.
And also I remember like as they were like leaving for garments like I would say works, and the pay gap of like the being the chutabua and like the
Yes,
work
yes, yes.
has a big disparity, I remember. And
Mm.
I don't like the word bua, but then again I'm
I
just trying
understand.
to
Yeah.
stating that like whatever it
Right, right.
I
Yeah.
remember my relatives and other people, they got very furious that like they kind of like pay those, I would say, the workers so low, and now they are leaving for this garments works. And
Right.
when they kind of try to negotiate the wages, the really empowerment came from those workers saying that like if you pay me more then I will reconsider that. I think that was the one of the most
That's
I think my
amazing.
early development as feminism kind of work,
Right.
and I remember like my mother kind of like having this negotiations about that, and like,
Yeah.
all the relatives have negotiation about that. And we never had like 24 hours like I would say workers. It's always chuta kach, okay,
Mm.
like for like 3 or in that time it came around that like now they are just trying to say like okay, I will do 5 works, I will do 5 activities or 4 activities.
Ah,
The categorization kind of came out, and then I remember like my mother used to have like two chuta like I would say workers who used to do like 3 works and 2 works, and they're kind of like combined as their wage. So that is
mhm.
really, really interesting. And I was always looking for the workers like, hey, just charge more. Okay, it's more like
Yeah.
and my mother would be saying
Sure.
like, you are my son. Why you are like advocating them? Because my mother also comes. So although she
Of
has a philosophy,
course. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's just this
like I would
idea. Yeah.
say BA, but then again, they also come from that whole middle class mentality
Of
as well
course.
as well. So I
Yeah.
cannot just dismiss that like okay, my mother
Yeah.
being anti-feminist, but then
No,
again,
no, no, no,
she's
no. I
she's
understand.
also like kind of negotiate the whole situation as the budgeting as well. That's one I really wanted to share with you. Yeah.
That's yeah. Oh, this is great because I think you've brought up something I've never thought about, which is that actually the rise of the garment industry seems to have increased the negotiating power of the tikabua or whatever domestic workers. I mean, even negotiating একটা কাজ করবো না দুইটা কাজ, I'm sorry, I can't go. That's a really good insight. I think that's a really, really important insight that, so thank you for, I'm actually going to use that now. I will attribute it to you, but to this discussion. I mean, this is what a discussion like this should be about, right?
Thank you so much. I really
Bringing
hope
up.
you will work on that as well. That
I will, I
yeah,
will, I will write.
thank
I
you.
will totally
Thank you so
do
much.
that.
So,
Yes, yes, yes.
so we're having this conversation in 27th of April, and like in 24th April,
Mm,
the Rana Plaza situation
right,
happened.
right.
It's such a tragedy for
Yeah.
Bangladesh, and absolutely a really, really, dark
Mm,
history of like how garments and
yeah,
the whole industry works. So you have
yeah.
written about empowerment discourse in development and corporate feminism in a post-Rana Plaza era. What are
Mm,
the contradictions you see in these narratives?
right. Actually, lots and lots of contradictions. And let's see. The first contradiction, again, the first thing I'll say is that the things that post Rana Plaza that have the steps that have been taken. There are two kinds. There's the global steps, sort of national and global steps that have been taken, which are about having the accord. I think some people will know there was basically brands and the ILO and the government got together to produce, to ensure garments work factories safety, the safety of the buildings, safety for not of the work, safety of workers, I suppose, but safety of the building so they wouldn't right? I think those are very good things. The real contradiction is none of that really ultimately helped, got to the core of the problem with workers, right? And here is the main contradiction, I think. There are many contradictions, but the main contradiction is the global supply chain and capitalism. And if you really want to know, down with capitalism, nobody will like me for saying that, but that's a very long-term goal. But in the meantime, we have to, I think, rethink the global supply chain. The contradiction is that why do brands like Walmart and H&M come to Bangladesh? Because Bangladesh can offer one of the lowest wages, labor costs in the world, right? So whenever there is any increase in the minimum wage, the brands can say, we're going to leave, right? So that's a kind of tool of blackmail. That's what's called the race to the bottom. And the brands can lease, but it's a tool that brands can use. That's one of the things, right? Can say that. Now, the other contradiction is brands also want to show that they are buying from a place that does not have sweatshop labor, because consumers in the global north don't want to, they don't really, they want to, as one of my students said in class that way, they want to assuage their capitalist guilt. They don't want to buy from, if they know that these women are working in sweatshops, whatever that means. So they want to buy sweatshop free clothing, right? So Bangladeshi garment factory owners have to show that their factories have good working conditions, pay wages, decent wages, and have to still be competitive globally. It's a slippery, difficult task, right? How do they manage it? What Rana Plaza did, now getting back to Rana Plaza, what I've written is that Rana Plaza took away, undermined temporarily the liberal myth of capitalist empowerment through wage work in factories by showing actually how dangerous it could be, right? That's what Rana Plaza did. So there was a lot of damage control that needed to be done. Bangladeshi factory owners lost a lot of goodwill because they were bad. They were terrible. The government was terrible. It was all but terrible. So they had to, but then brands then took advantage of that and started paying. They said, we'll stay in Bangladesh, but we'll pay you even less than before. This was not about minimum wage. This is written everywhere. There are studies that have been done on this. So by 2013, 2014, there are studies that this guy Mark Anner has done, which says that for each brands began to pay, they began to squeeze Bangladeshi garment factory owners for the price that they paid for an individual article of clothing that was made. What did Bangladeshi factory owners do? Well, they're not going to cut into their profits. What they did was they let go of a lot of workers, and they increased the quota of workers to much higher. So workers were basically working for the same way, but producing a lot more. So basically, the way the global supply chain works is that ultimately the brands get the most profit, factory owners get some profit, but the people whose bodies get depleted over time are, the people who have to pay literally with their bodies are the garment workers. And I had so much to say while you were talking about the older workers and the younger workers too. This is how they're related, is garment workers have increasingly had to work longer hours, and now they say it's inhuman, the rate at which they have to produce goods. It's much worse than it was 20 years ago, just the rate. If you just forget the minimum wage for a minute, just the rate at which they have to work, it's not almost not possible to do. Okay, but they're doing it. But if you do that for 5 years, for 10 years, you can't do that after a while. Garment factories are never going to take incoming. You may find a 30-year-old worker, but you have to enter garments as an 18 or a 19 or much younger, right? When your body can take all that, but literally your body gets depleted, quite literally, and it's becoming more and more depleted over time, quite apart from minimum wages, which I'll come to in a minute. But the garment workers are being used more and more by everybody along the supply chain, their bodies, because nobody wants to cut into profits. And I will say, in the question of accountability around Rana Plaza, we just have not done enough to hold the brands accountable. They have the most power. As we saw during COVID, they very legally withdrew from their contracts with factories. Okay, during COVID, there were 200,000 people who were thrown out of work without being paid because the factories that had put orders in just said, oh, sorry, we can't, our stores are closed, we can't take your orders. So factories, a lot of the smaller factories were forced to close down. And they did it legally. They got their very fancy lawyers to look at the contracts and to find a way out of this clause. They used a clause called force majeure to try and legally get out of the contracts that they were, supposed to pay for. So yes, the government can be corrupt, but it's not just about a corrupt South, a pathological, whatever place like Bangladesh. And we need to hear from the World Trade Organization or the IMF how bad we are and how we have to reform. That old colonial discourse is still so evident in in development discourse and in policy discourse. Part of my work is I'm not an activist in the field like many of my other wonderful friends are, but my work is to shift the narrative. That's how I see. And I think of that as an activist thing to do. I'm an intellectual activist. right? I'm not here to just contribute to theory. I'm here to unpack and redo and whatever. But I think Rana Plaza should give us the main contradiction that is there is that whenever there's a minimum wage movement in Bangladesh, as there should be, the government and the BGMA come down on it so hard because what they really care about is the capital, is the brands, right? This is why I say workers are not thought of as political subjects and citizens as rights. Workers are there to feed the machine of the EPZs or whatever. So there are lots of contradictions in the system. And that doesn't mean I don't want the industry there. Every worker you talk to will say, we want our jobs. We need our jobs. It's the conditions in which these jobs are being produced and the conditions are being reproduced that we need to really think about. So that's my spiel on this, on the contradictions.
Thank you, Dr. Siddiqui. Thank you so much. So can we talk about like how do we think about feminist solidarity that doesn't reproduce North-South hierarchies?
Oh, right. Yes, no, we can, we can. What kind of feminist solidarities in general, feminist solidarities? I kind of, is that, wait, I mean, okay. Well, I will start, I'm teaching a course on transnational feminism right now. And this class I had to start from, I ended up having, for various reasons, a lot of first year students. And they were expecting, a women's studies 101 class, which I have never taken or given. So I don't know. But so I had to start from the bottom. So I, um, I start with colonialism. You want to talk about solidarity, you have to think about how so-called feminism and women's rights becomes global through as a not quite handmaiden, but also as a central aspect of imperial subjugation. It's part of the civilizing mission. Civilizing women is part of the justification, right, for imperialism. So that's something that we have to remember. So already relations between the global south and the women in the global south and women in the global north are made fraught. I'm just going to talk about global solidarity and then I'll go to the Bangladesh solidarity part. But global north, I think those relations are shot through with racialized power relations, right? So how do you think about solidarity there? And I teach, for instance, I'll go through my pedagogy here. That might be one way to do it, if you don't mind. Which is that I showed something on science and the way women's bodies, African women's bodies, Southern African women's bodies were turned into objects of scientific inquiry. The so-called Venus Hottentot, right? And how ideas of gender and sexuality were central to ideas of race. If I can get them to think about that, then you cannot think about woman as with a big W. There cannot be, you have to constantly be unpacking that. I think we have to stop thinking of solidarity as we are all the same, we have something in common. No, we are not all the same. And no, what we have in common is what ties us through histories of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism, and race and nationalism as well today, right? So that's the first thing I think I would say to keep in mind. The second thing is, especially because I think I write about Islam and Islamophobia, and I do get a lot of pushback when I try. I've been told that my work on, theories of Islamophobia are not relevant to understanding Bangladesh. I don't quite think that's true, but anyway, I'm still working on that. But maybe they work in different ways. But then if you think about somebody I'm sure is taught in Dhaka University's Women's Studies Department, Mary Wollstonecraft. I don't know if you've read Wollstonecraft. There's no reason. I have to read her for teacher because I teach in this department that does some version of great books. And so I read her finally for teaching, and it's the vindication of the rights of women, right? I mean, my feminism does not come from any of these people. From reading these, my feminism comes from having read randomly Angela Davis's Race, Class, and whatever. I thought that was a brilliant book that really, it wasn't about my context, but I got it,
For me,
right?
bell hooks, yeah.
Yeah, right. So I was a little bit earlier, but yeah, I just got it. It just made sense. Um, so, um, so Mary Wollstonecraft makes this whole pitch to Englishmen why English Christian men should give English or European Christian women the right to education. Okay, and she's writing in 1792, right after the French Revolution. She uses these Orientalist images of Muslim women in the harem and how they are treated as enslaved and how they are treated as sexualized and how they don't have souls. And she's sort of saying to these Englishmen, if you would really think of yourselves as civilized, then you won't treat us this way. Okay? So I think a civilizational frame, which is how I think about the race, class, and gender and imperialism thing, is also very critical to keep in mind when thinking about feminist solidarity. I'm coming to your answer in a very long kind of way. But um, so there's that. So there's been a tendency, and we see this in development discourse. I could talk about what counts as violence, and maybe I'll do that. Can I do that? Can I bring in how many more questions do we have? Because yeah. How much time do we have?
You have
Okay.
it's your floor. You
Okay.
right.
All
You're
right.
the
Then
boss.
here is where, so when I first started off teaching women's study, well, I would teach a course on Muslim women. And I used to promise myself never again. It was such a tedious class because everybody, apart from all the Orientalism, all the women wanted to know what can we do for women elsewhere. And I did not understand, why do you want to do anything for women elsewhere? What about the women here in this country? I just did not understand. But that is part of the colonial imperial impulse, right? Women here are taught you can't, you have to, if you want to do something good, if you want to be a global citizen, save the women in Iran. Look at how awful their lives are. Let's not actually look at what's happening here. I mean, so feminism has a very, very difficult history, global feminism. And I want to leave that feminism aside. And I want to think about transnational feminism, a way to think about solidarity through the lens of all of the things, through a civilizational framework lens that allows me to think about how feminism has been instrumentalized and weaponized under colonialism and now with capitalism. So that's my beginning of the thing. I thought maybe you had an interjection. I thought you were going to say something in between, maybe. So I
It
want to hear it.
I mean, it reminds me of like um so as a master's student at Oregon State University, I from second year I have to teach courses by myself.
Uh-huh.
So
Good.
they started giving me courses like Women Worldwide, and I kind of like typecasted on that. Okay, but I love
Yeah,
that. I
of
love
course.
teaching that course. And last semester after my master's, and right now I'm working as a sole instructor right now,
Oh,
like
wow.
before I
Okay,
go to my
great.
PhD. So
Uh,
so last semester I taught Women Worldwide in person. A lot of folks like and Oregon is very white centric,
yeah, I imagine.
the
Yeah.
liberal spaces. So mostly my students are very cis women. Okay, there are very quite few queer people, but I always kind of like say that like, hey, if you think like this is a WGSS 101, no, it's WGSS 200 level, of course, and we're not going to go for basics. And women worldwide, it doesn't mean that like we're going to see world by like West
Yeah, yeah,
kind
yeah,
of like
yeah,
we are
yeah.
going to like to read like feminists all over the world.
Yeah,
So, there are a lot of like, whenever they come to the class and when they kind of read like, Muslim scholar and stuff as well. So I told them a really, really, very direct truth to them. It's like, see, like you criticize people who wears hijab. So just have you ever asked yourself, like, it's all about like women making choices that like if they want to
yeah,
hijab or not. And that's something I kind of like poked a lot of students and they come to me and say like, you know what? Right now I have this feeling that like yes, it's all about like women have the agency to like to make a decision rather than imposed by that, right?
yeah,
So these are really, I never thought like this would be a like a very enlightenment situation to like to kind of
yeah,
do that. But at the end of all of my courses, I always feel that way. Is like these are the small revelation. We think that like they're kind of like just because we argue up in this sort of notion that like West has all the knowledge and we Orientalists right now, like we are like,
yeah,
subjugated and we are subaltern, right? So
yeah,
like my also as a teacher kind of like feel that way. It's like at the end of the course, I always say like, like at least you understand like all it means that like women have the agency like to make a choice. That's it. If you kind of like get this whole I would say philosophy from this class, I'm good. Okay, it's more like
yeah.
that's I wanted to like to share with
No,
you.
no, I think you're
Yeah,
right. And I'm so glad you're doing that. It's got to be really useful for them because this is probably all they've never even had to think about it. Because those are the assumptions you grow up with. We are free, they are unfree, right? Therefore, we're going to, to be a feminist means to care about the world, right? To be a global feminist.
yeah,
And so we're going to sign a petition saying
yeah.
whatever,
And
right?
also
So I'm
I
so glad, yeah.
And also, I think after Roe versus Wade, a lot of, women are also taking a lot of WGSS class because the reproductive, I would say,
Ah.
situation. And but then again, but it's at some point it becomes a lot of, West centric. Like when like they're doing women worldwide class, but then again they will be turning assignments like, reproductive rights. I'm like reproductive rights, we have to see through the worldwide, not your
Yeah,
Western lens, right? So like still there are a
absolutely.
lot of like I would say disruptions with their
Yeah,
knowledge as well. I think as a teacher, I'm also kind of learning that, like
yeah.
who is your audience and how you have to serve them. And a lot of time is just like, it doesn't work, right? So that's something can be
It's hard. You'll learn. The Roe versus Wade, um, I wrote a little something. They were actually, this is the problem. This is the kind of feminist, entrenched Euro-American, I don't know what to call it, Oriental or superior sense of superiority. So when the Roe versus reading down or whatever they did happened, there were these cartoons going around. I don't know what you saw where there were all these white men in the Supreme Court sitting there, and they had a Taliban man, they were saying, yes, we've learned about the Taliban. They were basically attributing to the Taliban this idea of oppressing women. So what they were saying, they were outsourcing it. They were saying it's not us. We're just getting ideas from the outside when the US is such a patriarchal place. But even the cartoons, like even then, there is a way in which this
yeah.
north-south
American Sharia
dichotomy.
law. That is something kind of memes came out. I was like,
Yeah,
wow.
those
I'm
memes,
like,
they are
yeah,
outrageous, but
yeah.
they are saying they are constantly reproducing that inequality, that idea of the superiority of Europe and America. And that is why when you talk about solidarity, first I have to set those terms and say, do not even come to me. And I tell my students, don't even think of saving anybody anywhere. And two people who've really helped me think through that, people who have become friends and mentors are Laila Abulugot and Talal Asad. I'm just saying, that people for whom, it's not just getting things right, it's about how we understand why do we keep going back to the same tropes over and over, right? It's just we're saying the same things over and over.
This hypocrisy just came out whenever the conservative like I would say lawmakers, they're criticizing Iran about the whole
Yeah,
veil movement, and then they kind of like do that. I think this example I always use in my class to show
yeah,
that like the hypocrisy of like West, that like whatever they see, they're I always use like because Orientalism is very hard for them. I always say
yeah. No,
you
I
like.
understand. They're yeah, they're
I was like, this is how the see the world. Okay, we see the world. This is Orientalism. I have to do that because of like sometimes
yeah,
because these people take these classes, they are not from WJSs, they are required to take a course. So it's
yeah.
very
Oh,
disinterest. Okay, all the
oh,
time in my
yeah.
class, they're like being hostages or something. I was like, hey,
Right.
let's
I
make
know
it
that
like
feeling.
nice.
Yeah, my
Yeah,
class they actually chose, which makes a huge, I mean, I have to teach other courses that they have to take. So
yeah, yeah.
I
So,
know when they feel like hostages is such a great word. Yeah, that's called Vishishabe. Yeah.
Like as a Bengali, I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Okay, my next question to you is that now it's more personal. Okay, so your essays speak deeply to the question of who gets to tell the story, whether it's
Yeah.
about Islam, sexuality, nationalism,
Yeah.
or garment workers. So what does it mean for you to write politically and to um and ethnographically, especially about
Yeah.
Bangladesh for local and global audiences?
Wow. Okay. That's a, yeah, what does it mean to write? That's good to think about. Well, I think I said, as before, I said earlier that I think of myself as writing to shift basic assumptions and to shift theory. And I feel like I'm writing in a zone that's not very comfortable, shall we say, because I'm neither, my work doesn't fall into any particular category. Okay, you've got me stumped for a minute, but not too long. Maybe I'll change it. I like thinking through examples. I'm such trained in a certain kind of way.
No worries, you take all your
I
time.
okay, all right. So I think of myself as a feminist activist, to a certain, but but I want to understand. I want my feminist comrades in Bangladesh or here to really, to also understand my critiques of things, right? What does it mean? Okay, so I have two things. For me, it means stepping outside of the politics of rescue and superiority, which I've already spoken about. But to be an activist means to write, to intervene in global narratives. Okay, but also hopefully now that I'm a little bit older and a little bit more established, intervene in feminist discussions in Bangladesh. Okay, how to do this, where to do this. This is a really interesting moment. So let me tell you, so definitely politics of knowledge production. We've talked about that endlessly. That's sort of really where I'm at, but not in some, but in a way that has teeth, I guess, that has grounding. You said global versus ground. I'm a very grounded person in the end. I think about grounded problems. I want to look at key assumptions among in the history of feminism, transnational, feminism in Bangladesh. So, what constitutes violence, for instance? What constitutes, why are we looking at one thing versus another thing? So, I have this half written paper I will come back to. Why is Pulbari not a feminist issue? Okay, right. So, to think about that, this is where my feminism comes in. I am very interested because of the way I have decided to problematize feminist different genealogies of feminism. I know there are lots of homegrown genealogies of feminism. I know Rokia, for instance, didn't have to do all of that. She's an amazing example of somebody who I would say is not very colonized in a certain kind of way. I find her work really, really amazingly very quite extraordinary in how it doesn't deal with a lot of colonial categories of Hindu versus Muslim, religion versus secularism. You know, she's not quite doing that. She's not trying to recover anything. She's just very different. For the most part, in Bangladesh or in the US, if you think about what constitutes violence, it's violence on the body, right? It's violence you can see. So, and that has come from a particular history of struggle, global struggle in the UN, struggle in the Cold War. There's a lot that's been written on it, actually, especially in the 60s, right? When you had women from the Soviet satellite states and the Soviet Union, and women from the US, then the US wasn't particularly interested, but from the capitalist countries about what would constitute women's issues, and they couldn't agree. The first, and this is fairly well known at this point, but I always find it really interesting. So for one of the first CSW meetings, the Commission on Status of Women meetings, the Soviet Union sent, in 61, I think it was, the Soviet Union sent Valentina Tereshkova, whose name I know because my brother was obsessed with the Soviet science program. So I grew up with her, but I know her, and I would know her anyway. The first woman in space, first Soviet woman in space, 1961. The US was nowhere near there. The US sent somebody, but for the US kept sending people from their first family, Maureen Reagan and God knows, Hillary Clinton. Not, they eventually sent Gloria Steinem and everybody, but it was very different, their attitudes, but they couldn't agree on what constitute a woman's issue, because people from the global south kept saying, we want to talk about structural adjustment and access to water. We want to talk about Zionism. Leila Khalid actually was at one of the earliest CSW meetings. And then the US said, you can't talk about Zionism. You can't talk about, these issues, these political issues are not women's issues. What they could agree on is violence against women. Not that that's not important, right? But what we've ended up with, I mean, in 1995, I know Hillary Clinton is supposed to have given this marvelous speech, but even if you look at her speech, she was still telling the Chinese how bad the Chinese were and how wonderful the US was. So, she's talking about foot binding, all kinds of stupid things. Anyway, I'm not a fan. It can be out there. All right. Um, but I think we've lost a lot, and that makes on what constitutes violence. If, what was happening at Pulbari was also violence, this is where I want to come back, or when garment workers don't get paid on time, that is violence. It's not simply about, so you'll see these programs, donor programs, will give money for, preventing sexual harassment in factories, right? They'll do that. They're not going to do anything about intervening in the supply chain or whatever, because everybody is interested in this global capitalist system. All right. So I actually think that feminist imaginations have been really disciplined by the Cold War, by geopolitics, by this history of imperialism. So I write in order to, I suppose, I do a lot of clearing work, which clearing the groundwork, I suppose you could say, rather than this is what needs to be done. I'm still doing this is what not, think about what it is that needs to be done. Think about what we can say. And this, I've written this whole, you mentioned my work on child marriage. I think, I gave a copy of the book to Rehnumapa, who wanted me to come talk about it. But I knew immediately she'd understand it, but I haven't. Everybody in Bangladesh at a particular moment in time and suddenly was talking about child marriage, and I wanted to understand why. Right? And I have shown how, if you just think about child marriage, that is where all the money was. What is obscured, all the other kinds of structural violence, is obscured. And I won't go into it right now, but I see myself as somebody who keeps doing that. So because I don't know, I write out of who is it? Not Hooks. Who is the other woman? Audre Lorde has this wonderful essay on the uses of rage, right? But I write out of rage when I don't like the way things are. I didn't like the way Rana Plaza was being talked about. So I learned about the supply chain, right? I don't like the way Islam and fatwas and whatever. So I do write, about that. I write because I wouldn't say I do. I want to be part of the feminist conversation, but on my own terms and not mate, but I think the mat is really big. The field of power is also about how you think what a problem is, right? What a feminist issue is. So
Okay.
I
সবাইকে
don't know.
বাকিও থাকতে হবে না, why it's more likely that, right? Like, it has to be like, intersection. The one thing I really love about your work is like you always kind of like feminism and labor movement, you kind of like jot it together, because we do
Mm,
have this narrow thinking about like feminism is all about nari
right.
সমস্যা or something, and we
Uh,
also have this, and you called me a little bit, a little bit biadobi, but I really do think like Akono, the feminist movement, it's all very much very binary, okay? Like, I think there should be a lot of intersectional, I would say. I do feel like I'm the part of intersectional. I come from a marginalized gender minority group, right? But still, the work I do admire of you is like you kind of like make labor movement and also feminism together. And that's something a lot of folks saying that, like, this is a binary issue, why Naribad should be like collides with labor movement, but it's all about intersectionality, right? Like, it's just
yeah.
intersect with each other. So that's how I love your work as well, and thank you so much for the work you do. So you kind of like answered my next question, so I'm going to like to move to the next one, is that so you have moved between institutions in Bangladesh and the US, working in
Right.
universities,
Uh-huh.
NGOs, legal aid spaces, and social movements. How have you balanced those different roles, and what have you learned about the limits and possibilities of institutional feminist work?
Wow. Such deep, big questions, but yeah, right. Thank you, thank you. I hope I did say that, this writing politically and ethnographically for local and global means also that one is silenced in certain kinds of ways, or one is dismissed as bideshitaki, so one doesn't know. I do want to say that. And you know what? I'm going to refuse that. I just do want to say it. I know it was before, but I just want to say that, and this is related by going through these different spaces, is that I don't think I know less, and I don't think I have less of a right to speak on things because I teach in the US. I think I have to be very careful about my structural position here. I am looking at things from a particular structural position. You in Bangladesh are looking at things. If you're going to sit in Baridhara and tell me, I don't know, I just made up Baridhara just because I don't even know anybody, any feminist I'm thinking of doesn't live there, but there are women in the trenches. I have this conversation with my Pakistani friends all the time. It's not as though just because you live in the global south that you can't be elite. And they were telling me of defense colony or whatever. And so I was trying to think of an analogy, but that doesn't mean that you are also not situated and located, right? It gives you one particular kind of vantage point. I have another, right? So I want to make that very clear about global south and north. I do not ever, I will not apologize for the way for being here. And I will not cede the ground that somehow it's more authentic if it comes from there. And this is where and your point about the still binary, all of that reminded me of that. There is nothing pure about there as opposed to here. Okay, here is they're both impure spaces if you want to think about it that way, right? So I just wanted to say that. এখন তোমার প্রশ্নটাই তো ভুলে গেলাম। Oh, how the different
এটার
I'll
সাথে
tell
to
you.
add করে
No,
it
no,
remind it,
বলো।
it reminds me of like I had this conversation and I'm not going to name it, but I don't know they are being in the feminist space or not. I think there's a very influential, I would say, Gulshan based, I would say, very elite, I would say, class wise. And
Mhm.
we had this conversation. We're having a lot of conversation. At some point, I said, like, just because তুমি সুতি শাড়ি পরো, doesn't mean that you just kind of like erased your class, your identity, and you are part of that whole, like the movement in that sense. Like you can also talk about that particular class. Okay.
Right,
Kind of that offended them a lot and saying they like you are just dismissing my work just because I come from an upper class. I was like, no, you really need to understand your class privilege, and your upbringing and my upbringing are very different, and we came
right,
from a different kind of like situation. And that doesn't mean like I'm right now in West, like having this academic exposure. That doesn't mean that like you can dismiss my work saying like তুমি আমেরিকা থেকে বসে কথা বলতেছো, I'm still
exactly.
বাংলাদেশে, but তুমি বাংলাদেশে গুলশান থেকে কথা বলতেছো, I'm sorry.
Exactly. That
Okay.
is exactly what I'm trying to
Yeah,
say.
and also just because তুমি এখন সুতি শাড়ি পরো, that
Yeah,
doesn't mean that like you have just eliminated everything. I'm sorry if that just sounds a
right.
little bit weird, but
No, you know
yeah.
what you're talking about is the politics of location, and it gets very simplified by a politics of identity, which is global south. আমরা global south এ এত কিছু করে ফেলেছি. And I'm not saying there is no suffering or whatever, There's a lot, in the global south that's happening here too. You just have to live in, you have to live in New York and be pro-Palestinian and find out what it's like to live here and live one's ethics, right?
Okay.
আমি তো see, I got put I'm a little bit afraid to wear my keffiyeh outside now. People are getting beaten up in New York City.
Yeah,
Women.
and that's very scary, and it
It is
shouldn't be
very
that way.
scary, don't, yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so,
Okay, let
so
me ask you the question again, no worries.
no, no, I'm বুঝেছি, I remember the question.
Okay.
I remember
Okay.
now. Right, which is that I think I made some decisions always to be a little bit, I don't know how to put it. I said at an angle, but a little bit not mainstream. No, I guess I'm a little bit heterodox. I'm not a revolutionary. I don't go out of my way to break rules, but I want to do what I want to do, which means I'm not doing what people expect of me. So I wanted to traverse all these spaces to see where I belonged, in a sense. Okay. It was very clear. Well, Bangladesh, I think I had my first thing at CARE or UNICEF or something. I totally screwed it up after my PhD. I just couldn't do it. I just didn't understand what an indicator was. And we fired each other. It was bad. I lost a lot of money, but that was clearly not going to happen. And I'm not, and my ethnographic sensibility is so much about making things complex. Whereas if you're going to be in an NGO, they understand the complexity much more than I do, but they want clarity and they want things they can do. So I couldn't be the NGO, but I am very fortunate that I have friends like Sarah Hussein, or even much in the older days, Hamida Hussein and Salma Appa said, আমরা একটা করেছি on justice, gender justice, and shalish. What do you think about it? You don't have, this was not for anything else. They were just the kind of people who wanted my ethnographic insight. So I've always had access to these spaces. I've never worked at these spaces, and I've been lucky that they actually seem to appreciate what I do, thankfully. So that's there. But what I found out is that where I really belong is in academia, but not, I cannot do what seems to be US academia is like being on Wall Street. You might as well without the money, or at least,
I'm going to
I,
quote you from now. Okay, this one. Okay. I,
So much capitalist, you go ahead, so much capitalist discipline. You're on a Turkey, you have to produce, you have to write an American anthropology to get tenure. You have to have your second project done to get I'm just not interested. I wrote where I wanted to write when I wanted to write. And I've written a lot, I have to say. Considering, I mean, I'm old, that's why. It's not like I've produced a lot in the first 10 years of my life, but um, so I found a place, I'm very happy, a place, I found a non-tenure track, but full-time, full place that I really love. It has meant giving up a lot. And so I would not, right now, I wouldn't advise anybody to do what I did. I made a lot of decisions. My parents, bless their hearts, were not particularly wealthy, but they always said, don't worry about money, পড়াশোনা করো. So I always had this, I think now I would say, I've given up a lot of I'm not badly off at all, but I'm just saying it's a different relationship to precarity that one has to get used to. I've been very lucky because was am with somebody who's been able to think about things like health insurance. He's retired, so now he's on my health insurance. So anyway, but these are real concrete things. I think one of the things about feminism and activism is we have to think about materiality. And this is where your question of what you were saying earlier, it's, what you give up and what you don't give up. You have to be very clear-eyed. If I were a man, I knew ছোটবেলা থেকে I never wanted to be a man, by the way. This was so interesting. It was just like, wow, they have a lot they have so much responsibility, this family, this বোন বিয়ে দেওয়া, বাচ্চার কাপড় কেনা. Why would I want to be a man? But anyway, but I think the precarity of it, of making the certain kinds of choices that are heterodox, hits you at a certain point in life. I am very happy about the way I've lived, but I've been very lucky. That's all I can say. And I'm not necessarily saying I don't think people should live necessarily the way I've lived. I just want to acknowledge precarity.
Thank you, Dina.
Materiality, right?
Materiality.
Our
Yeah.
materiality,
Yeah, thank you,
right?
Dina. But I think before I kind of like ask this question, we are really we have entered a really dark time in
Yeah,
academia, right?
yeah,
Institutional being, like politicized,
yeah.
everything. It's a really dark time going into academia. Like when I got my PhD offer and I was talking on some of my friends, that there's like, are you mad that like you are going to
Yeah,
like
are
to
you
invest
mad?
your next
Exactly.
5 years into a subject which is being vilified extremely in this country. Like I cannot tell you in words. Like I have self-censored myself in my classes. I
Yeah,
have 88 students to like to deal with. I self-censored myself because it's not that like I'm scared. I'm just too much tired of this conversation as
yeah,
well. Because I think as academic activists, we also really do need to take care of ourselves as well, like
absolutely.
how hard we can push. So as I'm telling you, like as a veteran academic yourself as well, you have seen a lot, and now you are seeing so much, uncertainty going around
Mm.
a particular type of like I would say spectrum. So my question is to you is that. Can we still teach and write in ways that feel politically meaningful, especially in today's polarized world?
Well, yes, well, I think more power to you for going. You're going to a wonderful place, and you will be protected by your mentors, which is very important. It is really important to have mentors and role models. I think Shruti, my friend, is constantly talking about that, right? Um, I think it's a very tough time because um, I've sensed I keep telling myself to censor myself, right? It is hard and it does burn you out. I mean, last year in my women's, I had a fantastic women's transnational feminism class, and we were talking about Palestine, but it had been, for those of us who were just watching it from a distance, and it was a very small crowd of us who cared. The first time I said anything, and I was intensely watching as I thought it was going to stop after a month. It didn't. It was like month 4, and it was going on. And both of me, I told myself, no, no, this is very dangerous. I'm not going to do it because, I mean, forget authority. I'm just going to talk about the Palestine stuff. Um, just because I know that students can be very difficult and you don't know what your student is thinking. I mean, one year I had a student who listened to my first lecture on Orientalism and came up to me, it was on a theory class, and said, I'm a Zionist and Jewish. Is that going to be a problem in your class? I mean, it was like this huge man, you know, like, okay, so that was long before these times. But so I've dealt with it. I think, can you with self-censorship? I think it is more important than ever, but you have to do it very carefully. It's not it's not like you have to say in every single class, I'm going to do something. So I think, I found out that last year only 2 people in my unit. Last year I increased the number of things I taught on Palestine in my transnational feminism class because I think I sort of knew the students, but I started off saying I may lose my job, but, and then I waited, and that class nothing happened. And because nothing happened, then I really went. I mean, I said it was very spontaneous because I kept saying, I really shouldn't, and I can go to a march and I can do something else. I shouldn't do this in the classroom. It's how do you be a feminist theorist, transnational an engaged public anthropologist, and be talking about violence against women, be talking about reproductive justice and not talk about the genocidal violence that the Palestinian feminist collective was talking about. You have to, at a certain point, I just could not keep those worlds apart, right? It's just impossible. But you do have to be careful but you know what? Tenure doesn't, give you, doesn't afford you any kind of safety anymore, it seems. So I'm feeling a little less unsafe because like, people who are tenured are not safe. So
I'm
I think we have to do it. I think we have to do it carefully. I think we have to mentor students. I found last year I had a random Saudi Arabian student who generally did not like my classes originally. It was one of those classes they had to take, but she was going to be an economist. I was trying to get her to change her mind. But by the end of the semester, she just came to my office and she just sobbed for an hour because she was getting so much pushback on this anti-Palestine stuff. So those are the ways I think in academia, actually nurturing people, mentoring people outside of the classroom. It's not a propaganda. I mean, the propaganda war is there, but that can't be in your class. Teaching students to think and hoping they'll relate to the analogies. I don't know. That's what I think. I can't give it up.
No, yeah, and you are our inspiration, and you cannot give it up. So
Yeah.
who we're going to like to follow? So I live in West Coast. We have 3 semester systems. So I'm right now teaching a spring semester, and I'm
Oh
teaching
gosh. Yeah.
I'm teaching 2 courses called Women in World Cinema and Gender and Science. And I'm
Oh,
teaching in this climate wherever having this conversation
oh
about science
boy,
and
that's so
gender and
hard.
that.
Yeah.
So in a sassy way, what I do is that I publish my Canvas course like very, very I would say early. And I say
Uh,
to my students like, hey, this is the syllabus. You know what I'm going to teach. You are know whatever you do. So in the first class, I always said that you want to disrupt a class, choose another one. I
yeah.
cannot deal with this anymore. Okay,
Yeah.
so choose another class,
That makes
disrupt that
sense.
class. But here in my class, if you do kind of have this, mentality to like to have this conversation in a civil way, or like you have interest in this, stay this class. If you don't, maybe it's not your time to like to take this class. I really say that in bluntly because it's also my mental health as well. Like I don't
Yeah.
want to each and every class to have a like a debate or like have a heated conversation as well. And I asked myself, like, am I being a little bit, like safeguarding myself as well? I'm saying, yes, I am. So what's
Yes,
wrong
you
with
have
that?
to.
Like I want a class
Yeah.
where like we have the same mentality people and we're trying to have a conversation about these issues, right?
Yeah.
So, and absolutely in women worldwide class, women in world cinema class, a lot of folks kind of like sign up as a, like a cinema class. I say like, we're not going to talk
Uh,
about cinematography. We're going to talk
yeah.
about like, sound.
Politics. Yeah.
Like I'm sure like last class I showed Bend It Like Beckham by
Oh, I love that
Gadda.
movie. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And,
But
and and the conversations we kind of like having like it's really interesting, like they're exposing to this kind of like movies which
uh,
they don't consume because of the Hollywood and
yeah,
stuff as well.
of course.
Sorry,
No, that's really
too
great.
yeah, thank you.
I
Too
yeah.
much about me, but
No,
it's
no, no.
supposed to
It's
be
really,
about
you're
you.
really making me think. And the
Yeah.
question of class and what constitutes even the middle class in Bangladesh. At some point, we have to have another conversation about that, Mone Hotse,
Oh,
because
absolutely. So we're absolutely in the end of our conversation, but we have two more questions. So my
we
first
do.
questions to you is that like first, like not first, it's like last to
Mm.
first. Okay, so looking back at feminist and rights-based movements in Bangladesh, what moments or movements stay with you?
Oh, right. You did say that. A moment you may not know, but one moment was something called Yasmin Hatta. Again, see, my relationship to Bangladeshi feminism is around, unfortunately, all these Hattas. But yeah, with Yasmin was a little girl who was a Kajir me. We're going back to class again. Okay, she was 12 years old. And she really wanted to go home to see her mother. She was well, probably 9. I don't know if she was 12. She looked so little, poor. And she ran away and, she ended up being killed. I've forgotten even the story of Yasmin Hotta. This was in 1996, I think. Really giving away, yeah. But she takes this bus and then she's raped by 2 policemen. And then she never makes it home, right? She's going by herself. Some people help her, put her on the bus, and then whatever. Then her body is found 2 days later. I think it was a police custody case. There was a Shima Hatta after that too, but I think the Yasmin Hatta was really important because it brought together by then Bangladesh, the feminists, as well as everybody from the doctors to everybody else is very polarized, right? Including the feminists. But Yasmin Hatta brought together not just groups that had some kinds of tension. There was always a little bit of tension between the big group and the little, various groups. But this brought together everybody under and groups, ironically, and I will say this, groups like Ubinik were not really, considered to be way out there. But so this was Farida Akhtar and everybody else, Shirnapa, Mohila Purishad, everybody got under this banner. I forget what it was called, Shomilito Nari Samaj. I mean, we've had different versions of that. But they had the most amazing nationwide movement. They galvanized. I was in the US watching all of this as people, and this was right before Beijing, and Khalida was in power. And then, they would not let her, off on talking about how wonderful things were. If I'm getting my history right, I haven't checked all of this. It's been a long time.
Yeah,
But this
1995. You're in a
Okay,
correct.
all
Yeah.
right, thank you. Okay, so this was a moment at which I really felt the feminist movement was thinking about class, was thinking about police custodial violence, was thinking about the state. all kinds of what you're calling intersectionality, it was all coming together. And the outcome was actually also great, I think, managed to get something. Poor little Yasmin didn't get anything, but there was a lot more attention on custodial violence. So by the time Shima Hatta happened in Chittagong and she was a garment worker, there was a lot more about Section 52 or 54 or whatever. There was a lot more discourse that was not simply about the middle class housewife and not dowry, but whatever else. It was a wider discourse, and I thought that was a great moment. And I will say, and this is not a feminist moment, but these young girls, I don't even mean the university, maybe the university women, young women from the university, but some of these young girls in the July uprising, the way they were talking to the press. I mean, there may be a lot of criticism right now about how they've been disappeared from public view, and it's true. But I was just so proud and happy to hear them. Their analysis was just amazing, and again, not narrow. And, this was not about just me. I was just very impressed with that. More recent, yeah, I was really involved in a very invisible kind of way in the making of, I went to all the meetings. I just happened to be in Bangladesh during all the meetings of the making of the Domestic Violence Act. So I would go to a lot of the meetings. I loved going there. I have a very fond memory of that. It was a very processual kind of thing. And I loved, hearing these debates. So that's that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know we're having a lot of conversation and you're not
All
like
over the place,
all
but
over the place.
it's
I, I
yeah, but it's
I am all over the place. You're really in the place
no, no,
where it's
no.
okay. So my so like can I ask you this question about my last question to you, right? Is that how do you see the current moment, especially as authoritarianism?
Mm.
Oh my God, it's a really hard word to say. Like I would say, yeah,
Authoritarianism, I'll say, because I've been saying it a lot in class.
yeah, so I will say okay, fascism
Yeah,
rises
yeah,
globally, right? So how do you see the current moment, especially as fascism rises globally? What gives you hope and what does feminist resistance
yeah.
mean to you now?
Okay, I used to be very hopeful. Okay, the current moment has two different segments, I think, that are interrelated. And I think the first moment started with the onslaught on Gaza, when it was very clear that both the US and Germany and the United Kingdom um, would not did not care about international law, and that they would actively enable genocide through sending arms, but through lots of moral support. Okay, so that actually that moment gave me a little bit of hope that, look, everybody will see how hollow this post-independence, post-decolonizing moment system is. We live in a system where we have international law, but it's set up in a way that only the former colonial powers ultimately get to decide what is ethical or not, what is anti-Semitism or not, what is genocide or not, which bodies are worth saving and which bodies are not. I really thought that would be a global moment of change. And I am sorry, it just hasn't, my optimism is gone. What we've got instead is Trump. And I blame, well, yeah. Anyway, here we are with Trump and with global, already we were having global authoritarianism. I think we are at a horribly dangerous moment, where the gains that a global left, not the American left was also, until I think Gaza, they were beginning to realize how narrow they were. how not global they need it to be. And they need to talk about empire. I think we are between, for Bangladesh in particular, having Modi there, very authoritarian, poses a real problem. Having Trump poses a real problem for a small country like Bangladesh, right? We really need to have a lot of not talking. I think we need to strategize a lot about how to move forward. I don't mean just writing, but there are um, move forward in a moment. Stephen Saleta, I don't know if you know his name. He was a professor. I think he was a professor who got a tenured job at Northwestern, but because of a tweet he made on Palestine, he lost his job. He's left academia, right? Guy with lots of work. That was a long time ago. There's a longer system in which the Palestine exception works. That's one thing we have to always keep in mind. Much longer system, much before Trump. There's a longer system in which liberalism has always worked for the elites in all countries, right? Um, so we really need to dismantle our ideological go-to ideological systems, including in Bangladesh, I think. We can't just ask for the system to work. The system is working. Oh, let me just say this. It's the system is working just fine. This is exactly, the system will work. The Rohingyas got, nobody cared about the Rohingya genocide. The Palestinians are being killed literally every day and nobody cares. But that is the system at work. That's the UN global system with a little, without the face-saving measures, right? I just really think that now what gives me hope, having said all of that, I think it's a very depressing, very dangerous moment where we really, really need to come together to try and imagine other kinds of ways to organize the world. It's not a short-term problem. It's not a short-term answer I'm giving you. But I am very hopeful just seeing, for instance, these young women from the July uprising gave me so much hope. I just thought, I don't care if they're gone now, but the space opened up. They were thinking already something was happening quite different from the empowerment discourse that development shows you. Something was happening with those young women that made them think that way, right? That is different. So there is hope with this younger generation. And they weren't just thinking, I want my jobs at, in the government after it was much bigger than that after a while. So they give me hope, but Palestinian feminists and Palestinians and the diaspora and the way in which they continue to labor both to save people in Gaza, but to think what's happening, think through, to take every death and make something out of it. To take the death of this poet, Rafiq Arir, I've forgotten Arir, and say, if I die, remember me with hope. This is a moment in which things are falling apart. It's a moment, it's a monstrous moment. But we have to really take responsibility in small ways, perhaps right now, in ways that protect us and our communities, right? We don't have to be heroes. I don't believe in like revolutionary heroes. This is not the 1960s, whatever. Yeah. So, but I think what gives me hope is watching people struggle against the odds. I don't know if I could do it. I don't know how my Palestinian friends or colleagues who have relatives in Gaza and who, have to go to class every day. I don't know how they deal with life. They are doing it. We are at a horrible moment, but they are also trying to push back in different ways. There is always hope. This is, remember, I mean, Nelson Mandela was thought of as a terrorist, and various people, all kinds of, things change. We're at a terrible moment of fascism. Things change. I was going to say one thing. I'm a little bit upset at, oh gosh, okay, I have 15 more minutes. I'm a little bit upset. This recent thing on Kashmir, this is where I think we need to really go back to basics. Okay, I was a little bit surprised too. We don't know who killed all those people in Kashmir, but I was a little bit stunned to see people in Bangladesh saying solidarity with the, Indians or whatever, Indian tourists. And of course, solidarity with the Indian tourists. Nobody wants anybody to be killed. But there was nothing about, or the things that were coming out. I mean, the Indian things have been horrible. And I think goes to my larger question of why I'm a little bit worried about, larger answer about why I'm worried about India in particular, is that the
You can
Indians
have
are
your
seeing,
long answer. We have time.
okay, all right,
You have time.
okay, all right,
I have
all
all
right.
the time for you today.
Okay. But the Indian media, which I really do try to avoid, but one can't help it sometimes, is that people sent me things saying that we need to have the Palestinian solution. We need to have ethnic cleansing in Kashmir. So these things actually do travel, right? And these ideologies, and under Modi, India has become so blind. Indians, a lot of Indians are actually pretty violently, happily violent. But anyway, that aside, I think what I this moment is a moment where we have to try and think of violence. This is where I really think about Fanon talking about colonial violence. I don't know if you've read yet, but you will, I assure you, in graduate school. Colonial violence, to understand this, to locate this violence. I'm not saying the violence is right, but when you have had since 1948 colonial occupation, when you live in one of the most um, militarized zones in the world, and when tourism is being used, basically tourism and development is being used to evict you from your homeland, there will always be a certain group of people who will turn to violence. That's what happened in the Chittagong Hill tracks, right? You have to locate acts of violence, colonial, post-colonial, colonial, counter, what is this, insurrectionary violence, as Fanon would say. The violence of the colonized, he would say, is related to the colonized colonizer relationship. You have to locate it there. But it's become all about, oh, these violent Muslims or these bad Kashmiris, bad Pakistanis, it's gotten into the kinds of tropes, even in Bangladesh and in Pakistan, I'm seeing, that feed into Modi's media machine. And so Bangladeshis are becoming complicit in a fascism that they should really be resisting. That doesn't mean, I mean, I don't know why this issue is being turned into a Muslim issue. That makes me really sad. That, again, I mean, so this is why I keep talking about colonialism and decolonizing. The need to decolonize ourselves means, our brains means thinking about how colonialism has given us these handy categories which have produced Islamophobia and the bad, violent Muslim male, whatever, figure of the Muslim male terrorist. All of that feeds into not understanding, not to condone the violence, but to locate it. This is our task. This is what we have to do. And I haven't written, I'm just too, this is where it gets so exhausting. Do you really want to have another thing on Facebook with somebody? No, can't do it right now. But this is where I think we need to be very, very careful. And Bangladeshis, and unfortunately, we had a space after the July uprising. It wasn't a revolution, it could have been, But the July uprising gave us a space to come out of narrow nationalist discourses. Unfortunately, I think we've gone back to you have
The square one, right? Like the
yeah,
old book political structure, yeah.
a lot of it. And even worse, because now you have Trump and others. Now you have the Americans involved in tweeting saying, whatever. There's so much. Yes, it's a very, very depressing situation that way. But I would like to think that there is some kind of space opening that has come up because you still, and so one of my relatives was very upset to see the Jamaat, it wasn't Jamaat, maybe it was Hifazat, coming, rally against um, the Women's Commission report. Well, we've seen many of these
Yeah,
rallies
Islami
before.
Andolan also did it.
Huh,
Yeah.
right. We've seen them before. And I think Shinapa also said this yesterday, is, what July did was open up spaces for people to talk. We're not quite back at square one. We are still and I think the Islamists, of course, have gotten a lot of much more space than they would have before, right?
But I
Um,
also see this a little differently. In that sense, like I really wanted to add is that these
uh,
people are always like the last regime kind of tried to like to shut them off, and now
yeah,
they have space to like to talk. So
exactly.
I think shouldn't be a shocking. It's more likely they have the space to talk and they will
Absolutely.
speak because the last few years they're being so much subjugated. They're being like,
Exactly.
not being, like in a space to like to talk. So if you believe in freedom of speech, let them talk. Like until unless like whatever they're happening, but you're talking, they're talking. I think this particular July uprising kind of like made spaces all of the people to talk. This is something I can see. This is.
I absolutely agree with you, and this is exactly what I'm saying is we've had a plurality of space open up before. I mean, the 15 years, so when Aomi League থাকলে only the Aomi Leaguers could talk, and Islamists, were very conveniently let out and suppressed. BNP থাকলে only the BNP could talk. What you have today is a jostling for space, and they are part of that. And if you want a democracy, you're going to have to allow them to get on the streets, right? And which is what I can't talk in class. I can't say certain things. I know I can't write certain things. If I leave the country, I'm going to apparently have to clean up all of my things, all of my social media, whatever it's called, footprint, right? So I don't have this freedom. So I'm actually very appreciative for the freedom. I'm totally agreeing with you. And that space is a space we need to talk. Actually, so I want to go to Bangladesh. I don't know how it's, and maybe have more discussions on Islam and women, right? Or, fear of Islam and women too. There's a lot of fear. Because I remember that often with this woman, yeah, Najma Akhtar, who is here, so this told us a long time ago, when there was so much fear over garment workers sending their children to madrasas. Well, of course, because there's no daycare. Madrasas are much cheaper and safer. And she was saying, বুঝলেন তো আপা, মাদ্রাসা তো আমাদের পয়সায় চলে, Dina আপা। আমরা না থাকলে এই শফি টফি বুঝি না, আমরা না থাকলে, she literally said this. I wish I had taped it, but it was on the phone. She was in New York. You know, trophy trophy তো আমাদের পয়সায় চলে. Many, they have a different relationship. And again, I think class brings this out, right? There's so many different things going on. It's not just about women in burqas. And that's all. And this is not to say I support. I have been called a real Jamaat apologist for saying things like this. I have. So, but I think now is the time. I'm actually thinking now is the space and the time, because there is a space and a time for me to say these things and for us all together to have that alap, right? Anyway.
Thank you so much. That was really great, right? So you do have any last words or last thoughts to like to share with us to wrap up your oral history interview?
Wow. Um, I am very honored to be part of this. I really am. Thank you so much. I think of myself as a Bangladeshi living in the US. I can't think of myself as Asian American or Bangladeshi. I just don't, because that is my home. I love living here. I'm not a foreigner in New York at all. I'm very comfortable. So I'm not missing my English much. I get my English much cooked from somewhere. Yeah. So it's not that. But I really think of myself as a citizen of Bangladesh with real stakes, feminist and other stakes in the country. So that's why something like this is really special to me. So I
Thank
just want
you.
to thank you.
Thank you so much. Like my like as you said, like your rage kind of like leads you to like to write stuff. My
Yeah.
rage is that like there is no proper documentation of like
Yes.
intersectional feminist movement in Bangladesh. And I waited a lot of times, like, okay, fine, I will wait. And then at some point my rage went so bad. I was like, you know what, I will start this. Okay, I will start collecting this stuff. I will not wait for other people to like to
Uh,
another approval to do that. And then I thought like we have so many amazing feminists around us, and I do interact with all of you, but
uh,
like me who hasn't have their feminist consciousness yet, but where they will go, like what we're
uh,
going to like to do this whole preserving about our feminist histories as well. So that rage also led to me. It's like, you know what? I'm going to interview our feminist,
yeah.
and at least, you know, like maybe you're saying, maybe people are saying that like, oh, who will watch it? No, there is people who are growing up.
Yeah.
Maybe they will come up with this particular episode and they will have their consciousness about like whatever you have did as a feminist. And also there's so many layers. Like I never knew about Yasmin one because I also kind of like go through a lot of stuff, but then still I'm still learning. So see, like I also learned the Yasmin situation, and I really want people also to understand like how this feminist organizing is not hollow. It's not just like happens in Gulshan and Baridhara. It happens all across the world and all across the mediums, and these stories should be very preserved, not in a really academic structured ways, is more likely, very storytelling way. So I really appreciate your storytelling and sharing your experience with us.
আমার আরেকটা কথা বলার আছে.
Absolutely, go
You
ahead.
mentioned thinking of the future of future audiences. I just remembered. No, I think this is priceless what you're doing, and we need to find ways to archive this in a way that perhaps, that other people can have access to. So we can talk about that offline later. But do want to say, and I've had this from younger feminists, which is several, younger feminists have come up to me and said, Dinapa, you've been a inspiration. I got married when I was 32, and that was a long time ago, you know. But I got married to a white man when people were really, it was not, এখন তো, everybody's, so many, they all seem to be married to Davids. I'm married to a David too. But anyway, that's it. But I also, uh, my daughter is adopted, and there were a whole bunch of us, but I've really had these 2 points. So many people have said in those days that was actually really important to do. And as I said, I'm not a revolutionary. I don't do break rules for the sake of it. It's just what I wanted to do. That's just what happened. Right. So if any young person ever, is seeing this, do what you want to do without hurting people around you. I don't believe in this, it is my individual right. And so I will hurt my parents and, because I don't know. I have a very different, I really, view of relationality. And I didn't want to hurt my parents. I still did. I took my time. I think my parents, my kinship ties were very important to me. It didn't stop me from doing what I wanted to do. but I don't have this liberal individualist discourse in me.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I'm just doing this like Onoi who like a Onoi right now is like 16 or 17 years old. But they
Yeah,
really like I really had tough time to develop my feminist consciousness. So I really want our younger generation or maybe the people just learning right now.
yeah,
I always, like, I'm going to be very honest with you. When I moved here for my WGSS, I would say master's, I did my bachelor's in English literature. So like moving, I kind of like pursued it because I kind of like achieved my gender consciousness through my activism, but never had a theoretical background, right? So when I moved here for my master's, I really, really so much exhausted to see that like how South Asian like diaspora or like the structure has been dominated by Pakistan and India narrative and
yeah.
and you have to be Pakistani or like Indian in that particular structure. There is nothing called Bangladeshi, and I'm not for nationalism talk. I
No,
just
no,
think
I
that
totally
like I'm
understand.
just talking about like Bangladesh. We Bangladeshi, we do have different agency, different
Mhm.
type of our feminist movements, and also different. There are similarities, but it doesn't mean that like we're going to be. And I think I know an Indian scholar kind of or academic told me like why you get very offended if they call you an Indian. I would say academic. I was like, why I wouldn't be,
Do you want
right?
to be called a Canadian?
No, right.
Yeah,
Like I have my transparency and that's like my individuality as well, right? So I think a lot of time Bangladeshi feminist work has been kind of like, very much like generalized as South Asian and like in Indian and Pakistani, these kind of narratives. I want our individuality. I want Bangladesh feminism. That's why I think maybe this archiving work is so important,
yeah,
very rage bait for
right,
me right
right,
now is
right,
that,
right.
because of like a lot of time we're being just a small country and we are robbing it, like,
Yeah,
like we're just like dismissed as
right.
like I was like we don't have a voice. We do have a voice, right? And I
Do have
really
a
want
voice, yeah.
all of you to like, and you folks are being so amazing to me to like to do this stuff. And please, really, really, I would appreciate like keep supporting and stuff as well.
Absolutely.
And thank you so much for speaking up Palestine, to us speaking up Kashmir, and as well Rohingya, and also Congo is also experiencing,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
they're
There's
all
just so
related in
many.
a
They're
different
all,
way. It's just that the US
yeah,
gives so much money and they're taking my tax dollars.
yeah,
That's the only reason for me to talk about
yeah.
it more.
Speaking of Palestine, I think this particular time I was also being told, and also having this conversation about Bangladesh as well. I was like, what happened? Like, you also forgot Rohingya as well, right? This is going to be
Yeah,
like,
it's so interesting.
so we do have a goldfish memory as Bangladeshis that like we keep forgetting, but we really need to talk again and again.
Yeah,
Dr.
yeah.
Siddiqui, thank you for your time, brilliance, and decades of work that have shaped how we think about feminism, power, and resistance in Bangladesh and beyond. Your words today will remain part of this living archive, inspiring generations of feminists, researchers, students, and art activists. To everyone watching, thank you for joining us. Subscribe to Bangladesh Feminist Archives YouTube channel and stay tuned for more episodes. This is Bangladesh Feminist Oral History Project because our stories are not just memories, they are movements. Thank you again, Dr. Dina, and
Thank
thank
you.
you all for being with us.